Hello there, and welcome to the Deep Sleep Seas channel. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe you've had a long day filled with noise and motion, or perhaps you're simply someone who finds comfort in the gentle rhythms of the ocean rather than the silence of an empty room. Either way, tonight's journey is designed just for you. You have nothing to do but rest. Let your mind settle like sand falling through crystal clear water. Let your breathing slow to match the patient pulse of the tides. Let your body grow light, as if you're floating weightless above a reef, suspended in warm tropical waters where gravity seems to have softened its grip. Because tonight we aren't simply exploring the ocean, we're drifting down to one of Earth's most extraordinary creations. We're descending to the coral reefs, vast underwater gardens built by creatures so small you could hold thousands in your palm, yet their collective work creates structures visible from space. These reefs are rainforests of the sea, ancient cities constructed one tiny polyp at a time over thousands upon thousands of years. Beneath their colorful surfaces lie secrets about patience, partnership, and the slow accumulation of beauty. We'll glide gently through lagoons and over reef flats, past branching forests of elkhorn and brain corals the size of boulders. We'll discover how entire ecosystems depend on these structures, how millions of people draw life from them, and how the simplest of organisms creates the most complex of homes. Some of what you hear tonight may surprise you, or at the very least spark some curiosity as you drift into sleep. You'll learn of spawning events synchronized by moonlight, of partnerships between coral and algae that have persisted for millions of years, and of reefs that grow slower than your fingernails, yet build mountains beneath the waves. But for now, if these stories bring you peace, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next deep sea journey. And if you're still awake enough, let me know where in the world you're listening from. I read every single comment. Now let us begin our descent into the blue. Coral reefs are built by animals smaller than a grain of rice. When you picture a coral reef, you might imagine massive structures, towering formations of stone and color stretching across the seafloor. And you would be right to imagine this. But the architects of these immense structures are nearly invisible. Each coral colony, whether it spans the size of your hand or the size of a house, is composed of thousands or even millions of individual polyps. These polyps are tiny animals, typically measuring between 1 and 3 millimeters in diameter. That's smaller than the head of a pin for many species. Yet despite their diminutive size, these creatures are animals, not plants, not rocks, but living beings related to jellyfish and sea anemones. Each polyp has a simple body plan. A cylindrical column anchors it to the reef structure below, while at the top, a ring of tentacles surrounds a single opening that serves as both mouth and waste expulsion port. The tentacles are armed with specialized stinging cells called cnidocytes, microscopic harpoons that can be fired to capture passing plankton or to defend against intruders. At night, when many coral polyps extend their tentacles fully, the reef transforms into a garden of waving arms, each one reaching into the current to snatch whatever nutrients the water carries. By day, most polyps retract, creating the smooth, seemingly solid appearance we associate with coral formations. But here is where the magic happens. Each polyp secretes calcium carbonate, the same compound found in limestone and seashells. The polyp extracts dissolved calcium and carbonate ions directly from the surrounding seawater and uses them to construct a protective cup-shaped skeleton around and beneath itself. This exoskeleton is called a corallite. It's permanent, hard as stone, and remains in place even after the polyp dies. Layer upon layer, generation after generation, these limestone cups accumulate. When you look at a massive coral head, perhaps 5 feet tall and equally wide, you're seeing only a thin veneer of living tissue covering the surface. Everything beneath that surface is the skeletal remains of countless ancestors, polyps that lived and died over decades or centuries, each contributing its tiny limestone cup to the growing structure. The polyps don't work alone. They remain connected to their neighbors through a thin layer of tissue. This connection allows entire colonies to share nutrients, to coordinate their activities, and to function almost as a single organism despite being composed of thousands of individuals. When one polyp captures food, the nutrients can be distributed throughout the colony. When danger threatens, chemical signals can spread rapidly across the living tissue, triggering responses from polyps far from the source of disturbance. In this way, a coral colony exhibits a kind of collective awareness, responding to its environment with remarkable coordination given that it's built from such simple individual units. Different species construct their skeletons in different forms. Some create branching structures that resemble the limbs of trees, reaching upward and outward into the water column. Elkhorn coral grows in flattened branches that spread like the antlers of a deer. Staghorn coral produces thinner, more delicate branches that create dense thickets, providing shelter for countless small fish. Other species grow in massive, boulder-like shapes. Brain corals form large hemispheres covered in meandering ridges and valleys that genuinely resemble the convolutions of a human brain. These massive forms can grow to tremendous sizes over centuries, becoming landmarks on the reef, ancient structures that persist through storms that would shatter the more delicate branching species. Still, other corals grow in sheets or plates, particularly in deeper waters where light is limited. These flattened forms maximize surface area for capturing whatever sunlight penetrates to those depths. The variety of growth forms creates the complex three-dimensional architecture of the reef, a landscape as varied as any terrestrial forest, with peaks and valleys, overhangs and caves, flat plains and vertical walls. This structural complexity is crucial because it creates the countless nooks, crannies, and shelters that so many other species depend upon for survival. The growth of these structures requires immense amounts of calcium carbonate. A coral colony doesn't simply add material at its growing edge. The entire living surface layer continuously works to maintain and expand the skeleton beneath. When coral polyps are healthy and their zooxanthellae are photosynthesizing efficiently, they can precipitate calcium carbonate at remarkable rates. Yet even under ideal conditions, coral growth is slow by human standards. Massive boulder corals might add only 3 to 10 millimeters of skeleton per year. That's less than half an inch annually. Faster-growing branching corals can achieve 10 centimeters per year under perfect conditions, but even this represents just 4 inches of growth over 12 months. The massive reef structures we see today required thousands, sometimes millions of years to accumulate. The living layer of coral tissue is astoundingly thin. If you could examine a cross-section of a living coral colony, you'd find that the actual living tissue measures less than a few millimeters thick, a fragile film of life spread across an ancient stone foundation. This thin layer houses the polyps, the zooxanthellae living within their tissues, and all the microscopic organisms that constitute the coral holobiont. The term holobiont refers to the entire assemblage of the coral animal, its symbiotic algae, and the community of bacteria, archaea, and other microorganisms that live in association with the coral. This community works together as an integrated unit, each component contributing to the health and function of the whole. Understanding that coral reefs are built by such small, simple animals constructing their homes one limestone cup at a time fundamentally changes how we perceive these structures. They aren't monuments built all at once by some grand design. They are the accumulated results of countless tiny acts repeated daily by billions of polyps over time spans that dwarf human history. A single massive coral head 5 feet across might be several hundred years old. Its oldest skeletal material dates back before your great-great-great-great-grandparents were born. The Great Barrier Reef, the largest coral reef system on Earth, has been growing for at least 500,000 years, though the form we recognize today began taking shape around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago as sea levels rose following the last ice age. This perspective invites a kind of meditative reflection. The reef doesn't hurry. It cannot hurry. It grows at the pace of nature, accumulating millimeter by millimeter, year after year, each polyp secreting its tiny contribution to a structure that will outlast it by centuries. There is something deeply calming about this knowledge, a reminder that the most magnificent structures in nature arise not from force or speed, but from patient, consistent, incremental effort sustained across unimaginable spans of time. Inside nearly every reef-building coral lives a hidden partner. The brilliant colors of coral reefs, the yellows and browns and greens that paint these underwater gardens, don't come primarily from the coral animals themselves. They come from tiny photosynthetic algae living inside the coral tissue. These microscopic organisms, called zooxanthellae, reside within the cells of the coral polyp in a partnership that has persisted for millions of years. This relationship between coral and algae represents one of nature's most successful and intricate collaborations, a partnership so complete that neither organism can thrive without the other in most reef environments. Zooxanthellae, a din of flagellates, single-celled organisms that contain chloroplasts and can perform photosynthesis just like plants. Inside the coral tissue, they live in protected chambers within the gastrodermal cells of the polyp. From this secure position, they receive everything they need. The coral provides them with a safe home, shielded from the open ocean's predators and turbulent currents. The coral also provides carbon dioxide produced by its own respiration, along with nitrogen and phosphorus in the form of ammonia and other waste products from the coral's metabolism. These nutrients are exactly what the zooxanthellae need to fuel their growth and photosynthesis. In return for this protected environment and steady supply of nutrients, the zooxanthellae perform an extraordinary service. Through photosynthesis, they convert sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water into oxygen and organic compounds, particularly sugars and lipids. Here's where the relationship becomes truly remarkable. The zooxanthellae share up to 90% of the organic compounds they produce with their coral host. That's not a typo. The algae give away 9/10 of their photosynthetic production to the coral. These compounds provide the coral with a massive energy subsidy, satisfying up to 90% of the coral's nutritional and energy requirements. This means that reef-building corals are essentially solar-powered animals. While they retain the ability to capture plankton with their tentacles at night, their primary energy source comes from the sun via their algal partners. This solar energy subsidy allows corals to thrive in nutrient-poor tropical waters where conventional food sources are scarce. It's one of the great paradoxes of coral reefs. They flourish in what are essentially oceanic deserts, clear blue waters that contain very little dissolved nutrients or plankton. Without the zooxanthellae, reef-building corals simply couldn't exist in these conditions. They would be unable to gather enough food through predation alone to power the energy-intensive process of building massive calcium carbonate skeletons. The zooxanthellae also assist with another critical process. The photosynthesis they perform helps the coral precipitate calcium carbonate more efficiently. When zooxanthellae photosynthesize during the day, they remove carbon dioxide from the coral tissue. This shifts the chemical balance in ways that make it easier for the coral to extract calcium and carbonate ions from seawater and bind them together into solid calcium carbonate. In essence, photosynthesis by the algae directly enhances the coral's ability to build its skeleton, accelerating reef construction. This partnership requires light. Reef-building corals typically live at depths where sunlight can penetrate, usually shallower than about 150 feet. Though some species can survive slightly deeper, they require clear water with low turbidity so that sunlight can reach the zooxanthellae in their tissues. This is why coral reefs flourish in the crystal-clear tropical waters we imagine when we picture paradise islands and turquoise lagoons. Murky, sediment-laden water blocks sunlight and can smother the polyps, making reef construction impossible. Different species of corals often host different genetic types or clades of zooxanthellae. Scientists have identified multiple distinct clades of these symbiotic algae, each with its own characteristics and tolerances. Some clades are more heat-tolerant than others. Some perform better in low-light conditions. Some are more efficient at photosynthesis under certain nutrient regimes. The particular clade of zooxanthellae coral hosts can significantly affect the coral's overall health and stress tolerance. Corals hosting more heat-tolerant zooxanthellae may be better equipped to survive warming ocean temperatures. Remarkably, some coral species can switch the types of zooxanthellae they host under certain conditions. If environmental stress causes a coral to expel its current symbionts, it may be able to acquire different zooxanthellae from the surrounding water when conditions improve. This shuffling of symbionts potentially allows corals to adjust to changing environmental conditions, acquiring algal partners better suited to the new circumstances. Whether this flexibility will allow corals to adapt rapidly enough to keep pace with climate change remains one of the critical questions facing reef scientists today. The relationship isn't always perfectly harmonious. Under stress, particularly from elevated water temperatures, the partnership can break down. When water temperatures rise just 1 to 2 degrees Celsius above normal seasonal maxima for extended periods, the zooxanthellae begin to malfunction. Their photosynthetic machinery becomes damaged, and instead of producing beneficial organic compounds, they start producing harmful reactive oxygen species. Faced with these toxins, the coral expels the zooxanthellae from its tissues. Without the zooxanthella's brown and yellow pigments, the coral's white calcium carbonate skeleton shows through the transparent tissue, giving the coral a bleached appearance. This is coral bleaching, one of the most visible signs of coral stress. If environmental conditions return to normal relatively quickly, within a few weeks corals can recover from bleaching by acquiring new zooxanthellae. However, without their algal partners, corals must rely solely on capturing food to meet their energy needs, a task most cannot sustain for long. If bleaching conditions persist, or if the coral cannot re-establish its symbiosis, the polyps will starve and die. Mass bleaching events, where entire reef systems bleach simultaneously across hundreds or thousands of square kilometers, have become increasingly common as ocean temperatures rise due to climate change. These events represent breakdowns in one of nature's most successful partnerships, a relationship that has endured for millions of years now challenged by rapidly changing conditions. Yet in the intact partnership, there is beauty and efficiency. The coral provides the scaffold and the shelter. The zooxanthellae capture sunlight and convert it into usable energy. Together they construct reefs in oceanic deserts, creating oases of life where none should exist based on conventional ecological theory. This symbiosis between animal and algae underpins the entire coral reef ecosystem. Without it, there would be no reef framework, no complex three-dimensional structure, no shelter for the countless species that call reefs home. The partnership between coral and zooxanthellae quite literally builds worlds, underwater worlds that rival terrestrial rainforests in complexity and surpass them in certain measures of biodiversity. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine sunlight filtering down through crystal water, millions of zooxanthellae photosynthesizing within their coral hosts, producing oxygen that rises in tiny bubbles, producing sugars that fuel the slow construction of limestone palaces beneath the waves. This is the hidden engine of the reef, a quiet partnership between animal and algae, playing out in every polyp across every reef, sustaining one of Earth's most spectacular ecosystems through the simple, patient exchange of energy and shelter. Coral reefs are not built in a day, a year, or even a century. The structures we see today represent thousands or even millions of years of accumulated growth. Understanding the timescales of reef formation requires us to think in geological terms, to imagine timespans that dwarf recorded human history. This perspective shifts our view of coral reefs from static features to dynamic systems constantly growing, changing, and evolving over periods that make our own lives seem like the briefest flicker. The story begins with a single larva. After coral spawning, when billions of eggs and sperm mix in the water column, fertilized eggs develop into tiny swimming larvae called planulae. These larvae drift with currents for anywhere from a few days to several months, depending on the species. Most are consumed by predators or swept out to open ocean where they cannot survive. But a very few, encounter suitable substrate in shallow, sunlit water. When a planula finds the right spot, often guided by chemical cues from algae and bacteria already living on the surface, it settles down, attaches itself permanently, and begins to transform. The larva metamorphoses into a single polyp, a founding individual that will begin the process of colony formation. This initial polyp starts secreting its calcium carbonate skeleton and soon begins to reproduce asexually through budding. A small portion of the polyp pinches off to form a new, genetically identical polyp right beside the original. These two polyps remain connected by living tissue. They continue budding, each producing more polyps, and slowly a colony begins to form. The colony is essentially a clone, thousands or millions of genetically identical individuals working together, all descended from that single founding larva. The colony grows upward and outward, expanding in whichever directions environmental conditions favor. In shallow water with abundant light, many species grow upward rapidly in branching or columnar forms, competing to position their polyps as close to the surface as possible. In deeper water, species tend to adopt flattened, plate-like growth forms to maximize surface area for light capture. On the edges of reefs exposed to heavy wave action, corals grow in massive, sturdy forms that can resist being broken apart by the surge. Each species has evolved growth patterns suited to particular environments, and the mixed assemblage of different species creates the structural complexity characteristic of mature reefs. As individual colonies grow and spread, they begin to fuse with neighboring colonies of the same species, or grow up against colonies of different species. Gaps between colonies fill with rubble, sediment, and the calcium carbonate skeletons of countless other organisms like coralline algae, mollusks, and echinoderms. Over hundreds of years, what began as scattered individual colonies becomes a consolidated reef framework, a massive limestone structure riddled with holes and passages, but forming a coherent whole. The reef continues growing upward toward the sea surface. Most reef-building corals cannot survive prolonged exposure to air, so they generally stop growing once they reach the low tide mark. From that point, the reef expands laterally, spreading outward across the seafloor. In some locations, the reef grows as a fringing reef, directly bordering a coastline or island. In other locations, reefs form barriers separated from shore by lagoons of deeper water. These patterns of reef development were first systematically studied by Charles Darwin during his voyage on the HMS Beagle in the 1830s. Darwin proposed a theory of reef formation that remains fundamentally correct today. He observed that many coral reefs seem to follow a progression from fringing reefs to barrier reefs to atolls. He theorized that this sequence represented stages in the geological history of volcanic islands. When a volcanic island first rises from the sea, corals colonize its shallow underwater slopes, forming a fringing reef directly attached to the island's shores. Over millions of years, the volcanic island slowly subsides, sinking gradually as the oceanic crust beneath it cools and contracts. As the island sinks, the corals keep growing upward, maintaining their position near the sea surface. The reef thus becomes separated from the shrinking island by a widening lagoon, transforming into a barrier reef encircling the island at some distance from shore. Eventually, the volcanic island may sink completely beneath the waves, leaving only the ring of coral reef still growing upward at the surface. This creates an atoll, a ring-shaped reef enclosing a central lagoon where the island once stood. Darwin's theory elegantly explained observations that had puzzled naturalists for decades: why coral atolls, seemingly located in the middle of the open ocean, often had similar depths to the ocean floor far below them, and why they were shaped in such regular circular or oval forms. Subsequent research, including drilling into atolls to retrieve core samples, confirmed that beneath many atolls lie the ancient sunken remains of volcanic islands, exactly as Darwin predicted. This process occurs over immense timescales. A fringing reef might transform into a barrier reef over several million years as the island slowly subsides. The full progression from fringing reef to atoll can take 5 to 10 million years or more. Yet the reef persists through all of this, continuously growing upward as the foundation beneath it sinks, maintaining its position at the sea surface through countless generations of polyps building upon the skeletons of their ancestors. Not all reefs follow Darwin's progression. Platform reefs or patch reefs can form on continental shelves or other submerged features, where the geology doesn't involve a sinking volcanic island. Bank reefs grow on submerged banks that rise close enough to the surface to support coral growth. Ribbon reefs form long, narrow structures along shelf edges. Each type reflects the interaction between coral growth and the particular geological substrate and hydrodynamic conditions of its location. The Great Barrier Reef represents the most extensive example of continental shelf reef development. It formed as sea levels rose following the last ice age, roughly 8 to 10,000 years ago. As glaciers melted and ocean levels increased by more than 300 feet, the flooding waters submerged the continental shelf along Australia's northeast coast. Corals colonized this newly submerged terrain, growing upward to keep pace with rising sea levels. Once sea levels stabilized at their current position about 6,000 years ago, the reefs continued growing outward and upward, creating the complex system of nearly 3,000 individual reefs we see today. But the Great Barrier Reef's history extends much farther back. Drilling has revealed that coral reefs have been growing on Australia's continental shelf for at least 500,000 years, possibly longer. During this time, Earth has cycled through multiple ice ages and interglacial periods. Sea levels have risen and fallen repeatedly by more than 300 feet. During glacial periods when sea levels dropped, the reefs would have been exposed to air and died. During interglacial periods when seas rose again, new reefs would colonize the drowned landscape, often growing on the fossil limestone foundations of previous reef systems. The reef we see today is thus the latest chapter in a story that has repeated itself many times over hundreds of thousands of years. This deep history provides perspective on the timescales of reef ecosystems. Individual corals may live for decades to centuries. Coral species evolve over hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Reef systems persist through repeated catastrophes, rebuilding from surviving fragments after each setback. They are resilient across geological time but vulnerable to rapid changes within human timescales. The current rate of ocean warming and acidification is occurring far faster than most natural climate changes in Earth's history, raising questions about whether reefs can adapt quickly enough to survive the coming centuries. Yet there is something deeply reassuring about knowing these structures have persisted for so long. Reefs have survived asteroid impacts, ice ages, fluctuating sea levels, and countless other challenges over their hundreds of millions of years of existence. Coral animals first appeared more than 400 million years ago. Modern reef-building corals evolved their current forms about 25 million years ago. They represent one of the most successful and enduring groups of organisms in Earth's history, building structures that persist far longer than the individual animals that create them, monuments to patience and the power of incremental growth sustained across deep time. Coral reefs occupy less than 1% of the ocean floor. Let that number settle for a moment. Less than 1%, and yet within that tiny fraction of the ocean lives approximately 25% of all marine species. 1/4 of the ocean's biodiversity concentrates in these narrow bands of shallow tropical waters where coral reefs grow. This extraordinary concentration of life makes coral reefs among the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet, rivaling and in some measures surpassing even tropical rainforests. The numbers are staggering. A single healthy coral reef system might host more than 1,600 species of fish. Scientists have documented over 800 species of reef-building corals worldwide. Countless thousands of species of invertebrates call reefs home, including mollusks numbering in the thousands of species, crustaceans from tiny shrimp to massive lobsters, sea stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and countless worms and other organisms. Hundreds of species of sponges, soft corals, and other filter feeders attached to the reef structure. Even the algae are diverse, with coralline algae secreting their own limestone skeletons and helping cement the reef together, and countless species of fleshy algae providing food and shelter. This diversity exists in layers. The reef structure itself creates countless microhabitats, each slightly different in light exposure, water flow, sedimentation rate, and proximity to shelter. A branching coral thicket provides shelter very different from the crevices between massive boulder corals. The reef crest, constantly pounded by breaking waves, hosts different species than the calm back reef lagoon. The vertical face of a reef wall dropping into deeper water presents different conditions than the horizontal expanse of a reef flat. Each microhabitat selects for different adaptations and hosts its own characteristic community. Dam shellfish stake out territories on the reef surface, aggressively defending small patches of algae that they cultivate and harvest. Parrotfish scrape algae and coral with their beak-like teeth, consuming both plant and coral polyps, grinding up limestone skeletons in their digestive systems, and excreting it as fine sand that accumulates to form beaches. Butterfly fish use their elongated snouts to pluck polyps from coral colonies or extract small invertebrates from crevices. Groupers lurk in caves and overhangs, ambushing prey with sudden strikes. Sharks and other predators patrol the deeper waters at the reef's edge, maintaining predator-prey dynamics that cascade through the food web. The nighttime reef transforms completely as darkness falls. The fish that dominated during the day retreat into crevices and holes to sleep. Parrotfish secrete mucus cocoons around themselves to mask their scent from nocturnal predators. The night shift emerges. Many coral polyps extend their tentacles fully, creating a forest of waving arms capturing plankton. Octopuses prowl the reef, squeezing through impossibly small gaps in search of sleeping fish or crabs. Moray eels undulate out of their daytime lairs. Flashlight fish emit light from special organs beneath their eyes, using bioluminescence to communicate and possibly to illuminate their prey. The reef never sleeps, it simply changes shifts. The biodiversity extends to the smallest scales. The microbiome of coral reefs rivals that of any ecosystem. Countless bacteria, archaea, viruses, and single-celled eukaryotes live in the water column, on reef surfaces, within coral tissues, and inside the sediments. These microorganisms play crucial roles in nutrient cycling, breaking down organic matter, fixing nitrogen, and even potentially helping corals resist disease. The coral holobiont itself hosts diverse bacterial communities that may number in the thousands of species per coral colony, each playing specialized roles in coral health. This concentration of biodiversity provides immense ecological value. Coral reefs serve as nurseries for many fish species that spend their adult lives elsewhere. Juvenile fish find shelter among the coral branches where their small size allows them to escape into tiny crevices that larger predators cannot access. They feed on the abundant small invertebrates and algae. As they grow, many species move away from the reef to seagrass beds, mangroves, or open water, but they depended on the reef for their early survival. Estimates suggest that more than half of all fish caught by commercial fisheries in tropical regions spent at least part of their life cycle on coral reefs. The structural complexity of the reef directly supports this biodiversity. Studies have shown strong correlations between reef structural complexity and the number of fish species present. Complex reefs with lots of nooks, overhangs, and hiding places support more species than flattened, structurally simple reefs. When reefs degrade and lose their three-dimensional structure, either from coral death or from physical damage, biodiversity declines rapidly. The fish and other mobile animals leave to find better habitat elsewhere or fall victim to predators without adequate shelter. What's left is a ghost of the former ecosystem, dramatically impoverished in both species numbers and abundance. The interdependence of reef species creates a web of relationships almost incomprehensibly complex. Cleaner fish and cleaner shrimp set up stations where they remove parasites from larger fish that visit them. The relationship benefits both parties. The cleaners get food and the clients get parasite relief. Some species of damselfish cultivate gardens of algae, removing less palatable species and allowing preferred species to flourish, creating small farms on the reef surface. Clownfish live among the stinging tentacles of sea anemones, immune to the sting that deters other fish, gaining protection while the anemone gains nutrients from the fish's waste. Crown-of-thorns sea stars consume coral polyps, and when they explode in population outbreaks, they can devastate large areas of reef. Triton snails prey on crown-of-thorns stars, potentially helping control their populations when snail numbers are sufficient. Every species interacts with dozens of others through predation, competition, mutualism, or more subtle relationships involving shared microbiomes or chemical signaling. The reef ecosystem functions as an integrated whole, with energy and nutrients flowing through countless pathways, cycling and recycling as one organism's waste becomes another's food. The system exhibits remarkable resilience when healthy, able to recover from disturbances that would devastate simpler ecosystems. But this resilience depends on maintaining the full complement of species and the structural complexity that houses them. Some researchers describe coral reefs as the medicine chests of the 21st century. The chemical diversity found on coral reefs, with thousands of species producing defensive compounds, toxins, and other bioactive molecules, represents an enormous library of potential pharmaceuticals. Several drugs used in cancer treatment were originally derived from reef organisms. Antiviral compounds, anti-inflammatory agents, and pain medications have all been discovered through studying reef species. The economic value of this pharmaceutical potential is estimated in the billions of dollars, and we've only just begun to explore it. There is something humbling about contemplating this concentration of life. Millions of individual organisms representing thousands of species, all compressed into these narrow bands of shallow tropical water. The reef teems with activity, with predation and reproduction and competition and cooperation all occurring simultaneously at every moment. It's an explosion of evolutionary creativity, countless solutions to the challenges of survival packed into every square meter of reef. And yet, for all this complexity, the foundation remains simple: tiny polyps secreting limestone, housing algae that capture sunlight, building structures that grow millimeter by millimeter, creating the physical framework that makes everything else possible. The Great Barrier Reef stretches for more than 2,300 kilometers along Australia's northeastern coast. To comprehend this scale, Imagine a coral reef system longer than the entire west coast of the United States from Vancouver to the Mexican border. Picture an underwater structure so vast that you could see it from space, appearing as a complex string of reefs, islands, and coral formations extending across 14 degrees of latitude. This is the Great Barrier Reef, the largest living structure on Earth, the most extensive coral reef system in the world, and one of the planet's most recognizable natural wonders. The numbers describing the Great Barrier Reef approach the incomprehensible. It covers approximately 344,000 square kilometers, an area roughly the size of Italy or Japan, larger than the United Kingdom by nearly 40%. Within this vast expanse lie approximately 3,000 individual coral reefs of varying sizes and shapes. Some individual reefs measure less than a hectare, while others extend for more than 10,000 hectares. More than 900 islands dot the reef system, including continental islands with mountainous terrain rising more than 1,000 meters above sea level, and low coral cays barely above the high tide line. The reef extends across a remarkable range of depths and environments. At its inner edge, shallow coastal waters, less than 10 meters deep, host fringing reefs and inshore areas, influenced by river runoff and coastal processes. Moving offshore, the mid-shelf reefs experience more oceanic conditions, clearer water, and stronger currents. The outer reefs form a discontinuous barrier along the edge of Australia's continental shelf, where the seafloor drops away into deep ocean basins more than 2,000 meters below the surface. This cross-shelf diversity creates a mosaic of different reef types and environments, each hosting its own characteristic communities. The biodiversity of the Great Barrier Reef matches its physical scale. Scientists have catalogued more than 1,500 species of fish living on the reef. Over 600 types of coral create the reef framework. 4,000 species of mollusks have been documented, from tiny snails to giant clams that can weigh more than 200 kilograms and measure more than a meter across. 6 of the world's 7 species of marine turtles visit the reef to nest and feed. More than 30 species of whales and dolphins have been recorded in reef waters, including humpback whales that migrate to the reef each year to breed and calve. Dugongs, large marine mammals related to manatees, feed on seagrass meadows throughout the reef system, with the Great Barrier Reef hosting one of the world's largest dugong populations, numbering in the tens of thousands. Birds also depend on the reef. More than 240 species have been recorded, with 22 seabird species breeding on the islands and cays. Some of these breeding colonies are globally significant, hosting thousands or tens of thousands of pairs of terns, noddies, and other seabirds. The islands also support diverse terrestrial plant communities. On the larger continental islands, thousands of plant species create forests, woodlands, and mangrove communities. Even the small coral cays host their own specialized flora, adapted to the extreme conditions of tiny islands surrounded by salt water. The Great Barrier Reef is estimated to be at least 500,000 years old, though the current structure dates primarily to the last 10,000 years. During the last ice age, when sea levels were more than 300 feet lower than today, most of the current reef area was dry land. The corals survived in deeper water or in scattered refugia. As the glaciers melted and sea levels rose, corals recolonized the flooding continental shelf, growing upward to maintain their position near the surface. This rapid colonization and growth created the reef system we see today, though it built upon the limestone foundations of older reef systems that had formed and died during previous interglacial periods. The reef holds deep cultural significance for Indigenous Australians. More than 70 traditional owner groups have connections to sea country within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. These connections extend back more than 60,000 years to when Aboriginal peoples first arrived in Australia. The reef provides food, materials, and spiritual sustenance. Creation stories and traditional knowledge systems encompass the reef and its inhabitants. Many traditional owner groups actively participate in reef management today, bringing perspectives and knowledge accumulated over countless generations. The economic value of the Great Barrier Reef is substantial. Tourism to the reef generates more than $6 billion Australian dollars annually and supports approximately 64,000 full-time jobs. More than 2 million people visit the reef each year, participating in activities like snorkeling, diving, glass-bottom boat tours, and simply enjoying the view from islands and boats. Commercial fishing generates additional economic value, with thousands of fishers depending on the reef and associated ecosystems for their livelihoods. The reef also provides coastal protection, acting as a natural breakwater that reduces wave energy and protects coastal communities and infrastructure from storm damage. Yet despite its size and significance, the Great Barrier Reef faces severe threats. Mass coral bleaching events have occurred repeatedly since the late 1990s, with major bleaching in 1998, 2002, 2006, 2016, 2017, 2020, and 2022. Each bleaching event kills portions of the coral, and repeated events don't allow adequate time for recovery. Studies indicate the reef has lost more than half its coral cover since 1985, with much of that loss occurring since 1998. The northern and central sections showed signs of recovery after the 2020 bleaching, but the southern section continued to decline. Water quality issues from coastal development and agricultural runoff also stress the reef. Sediment, nutrients, and pesticides flow from rivers into reef waters, reducing water clarity, promoting algal growth, and potentially harming corals and other reef organisms. Crown of thorns starfish, which feed on coral polyps, periodically outbreak in enormous numbers and can devastate large areas of reef. Climate change drives both warming temperatures that cause bleaching and ocean acidification that makes it harder for corals to build their calcium carbonate skeletons. The Great Barrier Reef is protected by an extensive management system. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, established in 1975, encompasses most of the reef system. Different zones within the park allow different activities, from no-take preservation zones where all extraction is prohibited to zones permitting various forms of fishing and other uses. The park aims to balance conservation with sustainable use, recognizing that millions of people depend on the reef for their livelihoods and well-being. Despite the challenges and threats, there is something almost miraculous about the Great Barrier Reef's existence. A structure larger than many countries, visible from space, created entirely by tiny animals building their limestone homes one polyp at a time over thousands of years. It represents both the power of incremental biological processes sustained across vast timescales and the fragility of complex natural systems when faced with rapid environmental change. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you can imagine the scale of this living structure, stretching for thousands of kilometers beneath tropical waters, hosting millions upon millions of organisms in an intricate dance of predation and partnership that has persisted for millennia. Coral reefs protect coastlines with remarkable efficiency. When ocean swells and storm-driven waves approach a coast protected by a reef, much of their energy dissipates before reaching shore. The reef structure breaks the waves, forcing them to collapse and release their energy in turbulent whitewater above the reef, rather than slamming into beaches and coastal infrastructure. Studies have quantified this protective effect. Healthy coral reefs can absorb up to 97% of wave energy in some conditions. This wave attenuation provides billions of dollars worth of coastal protection services annually. The mechanism is straightforward but effective. Waves traveling across open ocean carry enormous energy. When a wave encounters the shallow water and rough, irregular surface of a coral reef, friction slows the wave. The wave begins to break as it reaches the reef crest, the shallow area near the ocean-facing edge of the reef where wave energy is highest. Breaking waves dissipate most of their energy in the process of collapsing. What remains passes over the reef flat, the shallow platform behind the reef crest, where continued friction and turbulence further reduces wave energy. By the time wave action reaches the sheltered lagoon or coastline behind the reef, wave heights may be reduced by 80 to 95% compared to their height in open water. This protection is especially crucial during storms. Tropical cyclones and hurricanes generate massive storm surges and waves that can cause devastating damage to exposed coastlines. Reefs help reduce this damage significantly. Areas with healthy reefs experience less flooding, less erosion, and less damage to buildings and infrastructure during storms compared to areas without reef protection. The annual value of this flood and storm protection provided by coral reefs in the United States alone exceeds $1.8 billion. Globally, more than 150,000 kilometers of shoreline in over 100 countries receive some protection from coral reefs. The protective value extends beyond just wave breaking. Reefs create sheltered lagoons and coastal areas where fine sediment can settle out of the water column rather than being swept along by currents and waves. This allows beaches to develop and stabilize. The combination of wave protection and sediment trapping creates calm, shallow environments perfect for seagrass beds and mangrove forests, which themselves provide additional coastal protection and habitat value. The reef seagrass and mangrove systems often function as an integrated coastal defense, each component reinforcing the others. Importantly, reefs are dynamic structures that can grow and maintain themselves without human intervention, given adequate conditions. Unlike seawalls and breakwaters that require construction, maintenance, and eventual replacement, healthy reefs self-repair damage and grow upward as sea levels rise. This makes them far more cost-effective than engineered alternatives for coastal protection. However, this self-maintenance capacity depends entirely on reef health. Dead or degraded reefs gradually erode rather than grow, losing their structural complexity and their wave-breaking capacity. Climate change threatens to undermine the coastal protection services reefs provide just when they're needed most. Rising sea levels will increase wave energy reaching coastlines. More intense storms, a predicted consequence of warming oceans, will generate larger waves and storm surges. Ocean acidification and warming temperatures that stress corals will reduce reef growth rates and increase reef degradation. The combination could leave many coastlines far more vulnerable to erosion and storm damage than they are today. The economic implications are substantial. Millions of people live in low-lying coastal areas protected by reefs. Many small island nations depend almost entirely on reefs for coastal protection. If reefs degrade significantly, the cost of protecting these coastlines with engineered structures would run into hundreds of billions of dollars, costs that many developing nations simply cannot afford. The alternative, abandoning coastal areas to erosion and frequent flooding, would displace millions and destroy communities and infrastructure accumulated over generations. Beyond the practical value of coastal protection, reefs provide less tangible but equally important services. They support fisheries that feed hundreds of millions of people, particularly in developing tropical nations where fish provides the primary protein source for many communities. The reefs act as nursery grounds where juvenile fish grow up protected before moving to deeper waters or seagrass beds as adults. Remove the reef and fish populations decline throughout the region, not just on the reef itself. Tourism focused on coral reefs generates billions of dollars annually worldwide. Tropical beach destinations attract visitors largely because of the beautiful shallow waters, white sand beaches, and opportunities to snorkel or dive on coral reefs. The reef creates and maintains the beaches through biological and physical processes. Parrotfish and other species grind coral skeletons into sand. The reef structure traps this sand and protects beaches from being washed away by currents and waves. The clear, shallow waters behind the reef provide perfect conditions for swimming and snorkeling. Without the reef, these tourism destinations would lose much of their appeal, and local economies dependent on tourism would collapse. Reefs also provide materials. In some regions, reef limestone has traditionally been harvested for construction. Coral sand is used for making concrete and other building materials. While uncontrolled harvest is destructive and unsustainable, carefully managed use of reef resources has supported coastal communities for centuries. The challenge lies in keeping use sustainable so the reef can continue providing materials indefinitely rather than being mined to depletion. The pharmaceutical value mentioned earlier bears repeating in this context. The chemical diversity of reef organisms represents billions of dollars in potential drug development. Several drugs in current use were discovered on reefs. Many more are in development. This value is impossible to quantify precisely because we don't yet know what we might discover. But conservative estimates place it in the billions to tens of billions of dollars. Losing reefs means losing this chemical library before we've barely begun to explore it. Perhaps most fundamentally, reefs provide existence value. They have worth simply because they exist, independent of any direct use humans might make of them. They represent hundreds of millions of years of evolution, countless species and ecological relationships of breathtaking complexity. They are beautiful, inspiring, and worthy of protection for their own sake. The loss of coral reefs would represent one of the great ecological catastrophes in Earth's history, comparable to the extinction of dinosaurs in its scale and permanence. As you settle into sleep, Consider that coral reefs silently protect hundreds of millions of people every day simply by existing where they do. Every wave that breaks on the reef is a wave that doesn't strike the shore with full force. Every fish that shelters in coral branches is food for someone's family. Every tourist who snorkels over a reef generates income that supports coastal communities. The reef works constantly, asking nothing, providing abundantly, a gift from tiny animals building limestone homes over thousands of years, creating protective barriers between land and open ocean, quieting the waves, sheltering the shores, sustaining the coasts. Once a year, sometimes for just a few nights, coral reefs explode in one of nature's most spectacular reproductive events. This is mass coral spawning, when entire reef systems synchronously release their eggs and sperm into the water. The spectacle transforms night diving into something magical. As if responding to some invisible signal, coral colonies across the reef simultaneously eject bundles of gametes that rise slowly toward the surface. The water fills with countless tiny spheres, pinks and reds and yellows and whites, billions upon billions of them ascending through the darkness like an underwater snowstorm in reverse, a blizzard drifting upward rather than down. The timing of these mass spawning events is remarkably precise. Most reef-building corals reproduce sexually just once per year. For any given coral population, all the colonies of a particular species, sometimes separated by many kilometers, will spawn within the same few hours on the same night. Multiple species often spawn on the same night or over a series of nights, creating spawning events that can involve dozens or even hundreds of coral species across entire reef systems. On Australia's Great Barrier Reef, the main annual spawning typically occurs 4 to 6 nights after the full moon in late October or early November, though the exact timing varies slightly between locations and species. The synchronized timing depends on environmental cues. Temperature plays a role in determining the spawning season. Most corals spawn when water temperatures reach a certain threshold and begin to decline slightly from their summer peak. Day length influences the maturation of gametes within the polyps. The lunar cycle provides fine-scale timing, with most species spawning in relation to the full moon or new moon. The time of sunset triggers the final release, with most spawning occurring several hours after dark. This multi-layered system of cues ensures that corals across wide areas will spawn together, maximizing the chances of fertilization. The synchrony is crucial because coral colonies cannot move to find mates. Male and female gametes must encounter each other in the water column within a limited time window, typically just a few hours after release. If spawning were not synchronized, the gametes from different colonies would rarely meet. The water would simply be too dilute with gametes scattered across time and space. By spawning simultaneously, the corals create a concentrated cloud of gametes where eggs and sperm from different colonies can readily find each other and fuse. Many coral species are hermaphrodites, producing both eggs and sperm. In these species, each polyp packages eggs and sperm together in bundles. When spawning occurs, the bundles are ejected through the mouth of the polyp and float upward due to lipids in the eggs that provide positive buoyancy. Upon reaching the surface, the bundles break apart, releasing eggs and sperm that can mix with gametes from other colonies. Other coral species produce only eggs or only sperm, with some colonies being male and others female. These species release eggs or sperm separately, and fertilization occurs when they encounter each other in the water. The released gametes contain high concentrations of lipids, making them energy-rich packages for the developing embryo. These lipids provide the nutrients needed for development during the planktonic larval stage. They also make the eggs positively buoyant, causing them to float toward the surface where currents can disperse them widely. The surface waters become coated with a pinkish or whitish layer of eggs, sperm, and newly developing embryos. This material forms slicks that can extend for kilometers, gradually breaking up as currents and waves disperse it. Fertilization occurs in the hours following spawning. Sperm swim toward eggs, likely guided by chemical cues, and fertilize them externally in the water column. The fertilized egg begins dividing almost immediately, undergoing repeated cell divisions, as it develops first into a simple embryo and then into a ciliated planula larva. The planula swims weakly using tiny hair-like cilia, though it's largely at the mercy of currents. Depending on the species, the larval stage can last from a few days to several months. During this time, the planula drifts with ocean currents, potentially traveling hundreds of kilometers from its parent reef. Eventually, the planula must find suitable substrate to settle on and begin its transformation into a polyp. The larva becomes increasingly sensitive to chemical and physical cues, indicating the presence of appropriate substrate as it matures. Certain types of coralline algae produce chemicals that attract larvae and trigger settlement. Biofilms of bacteria on rock surfaces provide other cues. The texture and angle of surfaces matter. Once a larva finds a suitable spot, it settles down, attaches permanently, and metamorphoses into a polyp. The polyp begins secreting its calcium carbonate skeleton and, if conditions are favorable, will eventually grow into a colony through asexual budding. The vast majority of larvae never successfully settle. Predators consume enormous numbers. Many drift away from reefs into open ocean where they cannot find suitable substrate. Others settle on surfaces that prove unsuitable, perhaps too shaded or too exposed to sedimentation. Of the billions of larvae produced during a spawning event, perhaps 1 in 10,000 or fewer will survive to establish a new colony. But the sheer number released means that even this tiny survival rate can result in significant recruitment in favorable years. Not all corals broadcast spawn. Some species are brooders, retaining eggs inside the polyp where internal fertilization occurs. The embryos develop inside the parent polyp, and only fully developed planula larvae are released. These larvae are typically larger and more competent to settle than broadcast spawned larvae. They usually settle much closer to their parent colonies, often within meters rather than kilometers. Brooding results in less genetic mixing than broadcast spawning, but provides larvae with a longer period of parental protection and thus potentially higher survival rates. The spawning event itself represents a massive investment of energy. Corals must accumulate sufficient resources to produce the eggs and sperm, which can make up a substantial portion of the colony's tissue mass in the weeks before spawning. After spawning, the colony is energetically depleted and must rebuild reserves. This energetic cost means that corals cannot spawn if they're severely stressed or if they've recently experienced major disturbances that damage their tissues. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can imagine floating above a reef at night, watching as the corals release their gametes in a spectacular synchronized display. Billions of tiny packages drifting upward through the beam of your dive light, coating the surface waters, beginning their journey toward the next generation. The reef reproduces itself, casting its offspring into the currents, sending them out into the unknown with just enough energy to drift and develop, and, if fortune favors them, to settle and grow, and eventually, years later, to release their own gametes in another spectacular spawning, continuing the cycle that has repeated for millions of years. Coral reefs come in distinct structural forms, each reflecting different geological settings and stages of reef development. Fringing reefs grow directly along coastlines, extending outward from the shore into shallow water. They are the most common type of reef and often the youngest, representing the early stage of reef development, when corals first colonize suitable substrate along a coast. The reef flat extends from the beach to the reef crest, usually quite shallow and often exposed at low tide. Beyond the crest, the forereef slopes downward into deeper water. These reefs typically form along young volcanic islands or tectonically active coasts where the land is not sinking. Barrier reefs lie farther offshore, separated from land by a lagoon of deeper water. The lagoon between the barrier reef and the mainland or island can range from a few hundred meters to several kilometers wide, and from a few meters to tens of meters deep. Barrier reefs often represent a more mature stage of reef development, forming when fringing reefs have grown outward, and when subsidence or sea level changes have created the lagoon behind them. The largest barrier reefs, like Australia's Great Barrier Reef and the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef along the coasts of Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras, extend for hundreds to thousands of kilometers and include numerous individual reef formations separated by channels. Atolls are ring-shaped reefs encircling a central lagoon with no island in the center, or sometimes with one or more small islands formed from coral debris. As Darwin correctly theorized, atolls typically form when volcanic islands slowly subside and disappear beneath the waves, while the fringing or barrier reef that surrounded the island continues growing upward, maintaining its position at the surface. The resulting structure is a roughly circular reef surrounding a lagoon where the volcanic island once stood. Many atolls in the Pacific Ocean follow this pattern, growing on the tops of extinct volcanoes that have subsided beneath the waves over millions of years. Platform reefs or patch reefs grow on continental shelves or other submerged features without a direct relationship to islands or mainland coasts. They can form wherever the seafloor rises close enough to the surface to support coral growth. These reefs come in various shapes and sizes, from small patches a few meters across to large platforms extending for kilometers. They're particularly common on broad continental shelves like those of the Great Barrier Reef region. Within any reef, distinct zones exist based on depth, exposure to wave action, and other environmental factors. The reef crest, the shallowest part of the seaward-facing reef, experiences the highest wave energy. Only sturdy coral species can survive the constant pounding. The fore-reef slope descends from the crest into deeper water. Different coral species and growth forms dominate at different depths, creating vertical zonation. Delicate branching species often prefer protected areas, while massive boulder species dominate high-energy zones. The buttress zone, found on many reefs, consists of alternating ridges and channels radiating outward from the reef like fingers. These structures form naturally through a combination of coral growth patterns and erosion by waves and burrowing organisms. The buttresses absorb and dissipate wave energy while the channels allow water and sediment to drain off the reef. These spur and groove formations can extend for hundreds of meters perpendicular to the reef edge and represent some of the most structurally complex parts of the reef. The back reef area, sheltered from direct wave impact, often features different community composition than the fore reef. Calmer conditions allow more delicate species to thrive. Seagrass beds and patches of sand often intersperse with coral formations. In lagoons between barrier reefs and shore, patch reefs dot the bottom, creating miniature reef systems within the larger structure. Deep reef slopes can extend down to 50, 100, or even more than 150 meters depth where the faintest blue light still penetrates. These deeper reefs host specialized coral species and communities adapted to low light conditions. Growth forms tend toward plates and sheets that maximize surface area for light capture. Zoogs and thelei in these deep-dwelling corals may be different clades than those found in shallow water, better adapted to photosynthesize at low light intensities. The distinction between reef types and zones matters for management and conservation. Different zones often host different species and provide different ecosystem services. The high-energy reef crest provides coastal protection but may have lower species diversity than the more sheltered back reef. Deep reef slopes harbor unique species found nowhere else but receive less research attention than shallow reefs. Understanding this spatial structure allows managers to design protected area networks that capture the full range of reef habitats and species. Some reefs exist in unexpected places, pushing the boundaries of where we expect coral reefs to grow. Deep-water corals grow in cold, dark waters, hundreds or thousands of meters below the surface. These corals lack zooxanthellae, and thus don't depend on light. They feed entirely on plankton and organic particles captured from the water. While they grow much more slowly than tropical reef-building corals, deep-water corals can form substantial structures that provide habitat for diverse communities. They remind us that coral reefs, defined broadly as biogenic structures built by corals, occur in a wider range of environments than just the shallow tropical waters we typically imagine. Some shallow reefs grow in locations with environmental conditions that seem hostile to reef development. High-latitude reefs exist at the thermal limits for reef growth, experiencing winter temperatures that approach the lower limits of coral survival. Marginal reefs in regions with high sediment loading or nutrient inputs survive despite conditions that would be considered unfavorable for most reefs. These marginal reefs often exhibit lower diversity and slower growth than optimal reefs, but their presence demonstrates the range of conditions corals can tolerate and suggests that reefs might be more resilient to certain types of stress than we sometimes assume. The structural variety of coral reefs reflects their long evolutionary history and their ability to adapt to diverse geological and environmental settings. Each reef tells a story about its particular history, the substrate it grew on, the currents and waves that shaped it, and the succession of coral species that colonized and built upon each other's skeletons. No two reefs are exactly alike, each one a unique expression of local conditions and history, yet all share the fundamental architecture of calcium carbonate skeletons secreted by tiny polyps housing algae, built up over long periods into structures that provide habitat for countless other species. Coral growth is patient work. the fastest-growing coral species. Typically branching forms like staghorn coral might add 10 centimeters to their branch length in a year under optimal conditions. That's about 4 inches of growth across 12 months. But this represents exceptional circumstances: clear, clean water, abundant sunlight, ideal temperatures, adequate nutrients but not too many, and no major disturbances. Many branching corals grow half this fast or slower. Massive boulder corals, the sturdy species that form large hemispherical heads, grow far more slowly, perhaps 3 to 10 millimeters per year. That's barely visible growth from one year to the next, less than half an inch of new skeleton added annually. This slow growth has profound implications. A brain coral the size of a small car might be several hundred years old. It would have begun growing during the American colonial period, or earlier. Every storm it survived, every period of warm water or cold water, every attack by disease or predators, every successful spawning event contributed to its size and shape. The colony is essentially a living historical record, preserving in its skeleton a chronicle of environmental conditions and disturbances extending back across centuries. Scientists can core old coral colonies and analyze the annual growth bands in the skeleton much like tree rings, extracting information about past ocean temperatures, rainfall patterns, and other environmental variables. The slowness of coral growth means that damage to reefs cannot be repaired quickly. When a boat anchor crushes coral or a storm breaks off branches, those damaged areas won't heal for years or decades. A coral colony destroyed completely must start over from scratch, either through sexual reproduction, when a larva settles and begins a new colony, or through asexual fragmentation if broken pieces survive and reattach. Either way, returning to the original size will take decades to centuries depending on the species and environmental conditions. Reef recovery after major disturbances follows predictable but slow progressions. When a disturbance kills large areas of coral, the dead skeletons are quickly colonized by algae. Over time, if conditions permit, coral larvae begin settling on the dead skeleton. These young corals are vulnerable to many threats, being overgrown by algae, consumed by predators, smothered by sediment, or killed by disease. Most don't survive, but a few do, and they begin growing slowly. Over years, the young corals grow large enough to start competing for space with algae. Some areas transition back to coral dominance. This process typically takes a decade or more, often several decades, to return the reef to anything approaching its pre-disturbance condition. Recovery depends critically on recruitment of new corals. If spawning fails for several years in a row, or if larvae cannot settle successfully because algae completely carpet the substrate, recovery stalls. The reef can become locked in an algae-dominated state, a condition called a phase shift. Returning from an algae-dominated state to a coral-dominated state is difficult and may not occur without direct intervention or major changes in environmental conditions. This represents one of the most serious threats to reefs, not just damage, but the inability to recover from damage, because the conditions that allowed reefs to thrive in the past no longer exist. The slow growth rate also means that reefs cannot respond quickly to rapid environmental changes. Corals adapted to current conditions over thousands of generations, accumulating genetic variants that allow them to thrive within certain temperature ranges, salinity ranges, and other environmental parameters. When conditions shift rapidly, as ocean temperatures are currently doing, corals must either adapt through evolutionary change, acclimate through physiological adjustments, migrate to new areas with more suitable conditions, or die. Evolutionary adaptation requires many generations and thus considerable time that may not be available if conditions are changing within decades rather than millennia. Some research suggests that corals may be able to adapt more rapidly than once thought, through mechanisms like epigenetic changes that don't require genetic mutations, or through shifts in the types of zooxanthellae they host, swapping heat-sensitive strains for more heat-tolerant ones. Whether these mechanisms can provide sufficient adaptation fast enough to keep pace with current rates of climate change remains one of the critical unknowns in coral reef science. Early evidence is mixed, with some corals showing signs of adaptation or acclimation, but others continuing to decline despite these mechanisms. The slowness of coral growth invites contemplation of different timescales. We humans perceive change on scales of days, months, years. We consider a decade a long time and a century beyond our personal experience. But for corals, meaningful change occurs over decades to centuries. The coral colony doesn't experience time as we do. It simply grows, adds skeleton, produces gametes when conditions are right, extends tentacles to feed each night, hosts its zooxanthellae through each day. The accumulation of these daily, yearly cycles over long periods creates the structures we see. There is something meditative about this perspective. The reef doesn't hurry. The coral cannot hurry. Growth proceeds at the pace dictated by physiology and environment, millimeter by millimeter, year by year. The immense structures we admire arose not through any single dramatic event but through the patient, persistent accumulation of tiny increments sustained across time spans that dwarf human civilizations. The Great Pyramid of Giza has stood for about 4,500 years, an impressive testament to human engineering. But many coral reefs are older, built not by conscious design but by simple organisms following the instructions encoded in their genes, secreting limestone, budding new polyps, growing imperceptibly but inexorably, building structures that may outlast every human monument. As you settle deeper into sleep, perhaps you can imagine the patience of coral growth. The slow accretion of limestone skeleton beneath tropical waters, each polyp adding its tiny contribution day after day, year after year, century after century, building without plan or purpose beyond survival and reproduction, creating beauty and complexity through nothing more than persistence sustained across deep time. Let that patience seep into your thoughts. There is no rush. Sleep comes at its own pace, gently, slowly, like coral growing in the warm, clear waters of a tropical reef. The economic value of coral reefs extends far beyond their obvious beauty. Globally, coral reefs provide ecosystem services estimated to be worth trillions of dollars. One comprehensive assessment valued the annual net benefit from coral reefs worldwide at nearly $30 billion. This value derives from multiple sources: coastal protection, fisheries, tourism and recreation, and biodiversity. No single category dominates, rather the value spreads across these different services, reflecting the multiple ways reefs benefit humanity. Tourism and recreation alone account for billions of dollars annually. Coral reefs attract millions of tourists each year seeking to snorkel, dive, or simply enjoy tropical beaches and clear waters. This tourism supports entire economies in many regions. Small island nations in the Caribbean and Pacific rely heavily on reef tourism for foreign exchange and employment. Dive operators, resort hotels, restaurants, tour guides, and countless other businesses depend directly or indirectly on healthy reefs attracting visitors. When reefs degrade, tourism declines, devastating local economies. Fisheries provide another major economic benefit. Though estimates vary, the value of reef-associated fisheries globally ranges into billions of dollars annually. These fisheries provide protein for hundreds of millions of people, particularly in developing tropical nations where alternative food sources may be limited. Reef fish feed families, supply local markets, and in some cases support export fisheries. Many commercially important fish species spend part of their life cycle on reefs, lose the reefs, and fish populations decline region-wide, not just on the reefs themselves, creating cascading effects on food security and nutrition. Coastal protection provides economic benefits that often go unnoticed until they're lost. The billions of dollars in flood protection services reefs provide represent avoided damages. When a storm strikes a coast protected by reefs, the reduced wave energy means less flooding, less erosion, less damage to buildings and infrastructure. These avoided costs never appear as explicit benefits in accounting systems, but they're very real. The alternative, protecting the same coastlines with engineered structures like seawalls, would cost many times more than current expenditures on reef conservation. Pharmaceutical discoveries from reef organisms represent another category of economic value, though it's difficult to quantify precisely. Several drugs in current medical use were discovered on coral reefs. The anti-cancer compounds C, and others came from Caribbean reef sponges. Antiviral medications have been derived from reef organisms. Research continues to discover new bioactive compounds from reef species. The potential value of undiscovered pharmaceuticals could be enormous, potentially worth hundreds of billions of dollars if major new drugs emerge from reef research. This represents option value. the value of keeping reefs intact so we have the option to discover and utilize these compounds in the future. Biodiversity itself has economic value beyond specific uses. The maintenance of genetic diversity and ecosystem function provides resilience against future uncertainties. Diverse ecosystems tend to be more stable and productive than simple ones. They respond better to disturbances. They provide more opportunities for discovering new products and services. While difficult to quantify, this biodiversity value has been estimated at several $1 billion annually for coral reefs globally. The employment supported by coral reefs runs into millions of jobs worldwide. Tourism, fisheries, research, management, and other reef-related activities provide livelihoods for countless people. The Great Barrier Reef alone supports more than 60,000 full-time jobs in Australia. Globally, the number is orders of magnitude larger, encompassing everyone from subsistence fishers to resort workers to marine biologists. These jobs support families and communities, often in regions with limited alternative employment opportunities. The value of reefs becomes even clearer when we consider what happens when they degrade. Several regions have experienced massive reef degradation due to various factors. In these areas, fisheries have collapsed, tourism has declined dramatically, coastal erosion has accelerated, and local economies have suffered greatly. The loss of reefs has pushed communities into poverty, forced people to migrate in search of alternative livelihoods, and generally demonstrated that healthy reefs represent economic assets of immense value. Conservation and restoration of reefs represent economically sound investments. The cost of protecting and managing reefs is typically far less than the value of the services they provide. Even restoration, which can be quite expensive, often pencils out economically when the full value of restored reefs is considered. The benefit-to-cost ratios for reef conservation generally favor strong protection and active management. Yet despite these obvious economic benefits, reef conservation often struggles for funding and political support. The benefits of reefs are diffuse, spread across many people and economic sectors, while the costs of protection and restrictions on harmful activities are often concentrated on specific industries or interest groups. Political systems often favor concentrated interests over diffuse benefits, making reef conservation politically challenging despite clear economic justification. As you drift closer to sleep, consider that coral reefs represent not just natural wonders, but economic engines supporting millions of livelihoods, protecting billions of dollars in coastal property, feeding countless families, and harboring potential cures for diseases. The tiny polyps secreting limestone beneath tropical waters create value that ripples outward through economies and societies, providing services that humans could not easily replace if the reefs were lost. The reef works constantly, generating benefits, asking only to be left healthy enough to continue its slow, patient growth. And now, as sleep approaches more closely, let us return to where we began. You have drifted through coral gardens tonight, learned of polyps and zooxanthellae, of spawning and growth, of biodiversity and protection. You've explored the Great Barrier Reef's vast expanse and considered the economic value of these structures built so slowly by such small creatures. Perhaps your understanding of coral reefs has deepened. Perhaps you've gained a new appreciation for these ecosystems that cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, yet support 25% of marine life. You are connected to coral reefs, even if you've never seen one. The oxygen in your breath, a portion of it was produced by marine photosynthesis, including the zooxanthellae in coral tissues. The fish on dinner tables, many species spent time in coral reefs during some part of their life cycle. The beaches you walk, many are made of coral sand, ground-up skeletons, processed through the digestive systems of parrotfish and other reef inhabitants. The coastlines protected from storms, reefs break the waves. The future medicines that might cure diseases, some will come from reef organisms we haven't yet studied. More fundamentally, you are connected to reefs through the simple fact of sharing this planet. The same ocean water that bathes coral reefs circulates through all ocean basins, connecting tropical waters to polar seas to your local coast. The atmosphere that absorbs heat from tropical seas affects weather patterns worldwide. The extinction crisis affecting coral reefs is part of the larger biodiversity crisis affecting all ecosystems, including those you walk through daily. We live in an interconnected world, and coral reefs are one particularly spectacular node in that web of connections. The reefs continue their patient work tonight, as you sleep. Polyps extend tentacles to capture plankton. Zooxanthellae photosynthesize when dawn comes to their part of the ocean. Calcium carbonate precipitates millimeter by millimeter. Fish shelter in coral branches. Larvae drift in currents. The reef grows and changes and lives, following rhythms established over millions of years, indifferent to human concerns yet profoundly important to human welfare. There is something deeply peaceful about knowing these processes continue independent of your awareness of them. The reef doesn't need you to think about it to keep functioning. It simply is, existing and persisting, built by organisms following ancient instructions encoded in DNA, creating beauty and complexity and value through nothing more than living their lives generation after generation. The reef asks nothing. It offers everything. Protection for coasts, food for millions, wonder for anyone who glimpses its beauty, inspiration for scientists and artists and anyone who contemplates its extraordinary architecture and ecology. As sleep takes you, let the image of a coral reef drift through your mind. Clear, warm water, sunlight filtering down in dancing patterns, coral formations in countless shapes and colors, fish weaving through branches, sea turtles gliding past, the quiet pulse of the ocean breathing across the reef flat. Let it all fade into the background as your thoughts slow and scatter and dissolve into the formless peace of deep sleep. The reef will be there tomorrow, growing patiently, sheltering countless lives, continuing its ancient work. You have wandered through underwater gardens tonight, exploring one of Earth's great ecosystems, learning of the tiny architects who build structures larger than cities, stone by stone, year by year, creating homes for millions of organisms in waters that would otherwise support far less life. You've learned that beauty and value can accumulate slowly, that patience sustained across deep time creates marvels that no hurried effort could match, that partnership and cooperation between coral and algae can sustain entire ecosystems for millennia. Perhaps tomorrow you'll remember something from tonight's journey. Perhaps you'll think of coral reefs differently, seeing them not just as beautiful scenery, but as living cities built by simple organisms following ancient patterns, providing immense value to the world while asking nothing in return except clean water and stable conditions. Perhaps you'll feel more connected to these distant tropical ecosystems, recognizing that they're part of your world, part of the great interconnected community of life that shares this blue planet. But for now, let all thoughts fade away. Let your breathing slow to match the gentle rhythm of waves washing over a reef flat. Let your mind grow quiet as a sheltered lagoon. Let sleep embrace you like warm tropical water, gentle and encompassing and peaceful. Tomorrow will bring its own concerns and activities. Tonight is for rest, for restoration, for drifting in the dark like a planular lava in the current, safe and carried and completely at peace. The reefs grow on through the night. The ocean breathes in and out across continents. Stars wheel overhead, and you float in the space between waking and sleeping, weightless, thoughtless, peaceful, descending slowly into the deep rest that allows tomorrow to be bright and clear and full of possibility. Sleep well, dream of blue water and ancient reefs and the patient, timeless rhythm of waves. Good night.